everyone, and welcome to KSAU Master Talk. I'm your host, Dr. Nadine Al-Musnid, and today we have the pleasure of having Mr. Diklan Kieran, the global leader in science and policy. He has worked on some of the world's largest and biggest science initiatives and led the effort to connect science with the decision-making. Diklan, thank you for joining us.
Delighted to be here, Dr. Nazim. Thank you.
Let's start with your story. How did you get started into the science policy?
It was not part of a grand plan. It was accidental, really. I was working in the US and decided I wanted to change, and then decided to move to France, and then from there started working on a couple of European Union projects, which brought me to the Middle East. And from that, ended up doing a UN study on the telecommunication system for the occupied territories.
Yeah.
And then from that, we got involved in the science dissemination. So joined the European Commission to do that, and then set up the European Commission Science Dissemination Service. It's called CORDIS, still there. And my work on that led me very closely to work with a lot of research actors and stakeholders. And through that, I realized that science policy became very defining. And from that, decided to set up my own advisory firm on science policy, ISC. Did that, and then started to work pretty much exclusively on science policy. So that's the short version of how I got to work in science policy.
So you have worked with so many organizations and governments. Tell us more about ICS Intelligence.
Well, IC Intelligence, as I mentioned, is the organization I set up to deliver science policy guidance and advice. And in that pursuit, we developed a lot of specialization in policy making, particularly the European Union Parliament, and the United States Congress, and then built gateways for stakeholders into policy making in both the US and the European Union, and typically represented and still do many governments. And their interest generally was A, understanding how policy evolves, and B, then seeing the implications for their activities, their organizations, and then C, thirdly, what to do about it. And ISC has developed that capacity. And we do that in, as I said, a number of theaters. I suppose the main focus over the last 10 years has been a better and more frequent engagement with Africa. One of the flagship projects we developed with Africa was the Square Kilometre Array Telescope.
Yes. And
that was it was and still is
I was going to ask you about it.
Yeah, we'll happy to speak more about it. And that really helped me understand the interplay between big science, science capacity building, and the important role of policy making therein. So that's just a little bit about ISC.
So partnership seems to be a big part of your work. Why is it so important to have international collaboration in science?
I suppose very simply because if you look at what science addresses, and if you look at science priorities in the area of health, in the area of communications technologies, energy, environment, you find that simply the challenges are global. It's that simple. And to my mind, if you then are not assembling global coalitions to address these global challenges, then the exercise will be deficient. Also, I'm reminded of a phrase I hear in Africa a lot. If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go further and far, go together. Sure. So I'm very much in the together camp. And in the activities we do, I think it's proven very, very frequently that if you bring folk together, then you find solutions which otherwise are not evident. And very often that's not a linear process. It's not a 1 and 1 equals 2 process. Very, very, very much not so. And I've experienced that very much. So I'm then very much open to serendipitous outcomes. And while you can't predict and analyze these and you can't be prescriptive, the evidence is that there are many, many beneficial outcomes from building global partnerships and global collaborations. Also, I have worked on a number of research infrastructures, and one example would be the European Union Biobanking and Biomolecular Resources Research Infrastructure, BBMRI. It's part of the European Union Strategy Forum on Research Infrastructures, which is designed, as the name might suggest, to build coalitions for capacity building. And I've learned from the BBMRI experience that really you have a huge value to bring to people by creating a bigger capacity and access to sample data on molecules. And of course, then the potential to share that is enormous. And while these, in the names I've discussed there, the European Union infrastructure, et cetera, but now these are increasingly global. And last year we had a meeting which promoted the European Union research infrastructures in Africa and in Asia. And I think this is something we can look forward to a lot more of. So very much capacity is global, as simple as that. I think what's lacking is the global enabling policy environment to make this happen. I think the scientists have the solutions, but policymakers need to get behind that and understand. And very often national interests get in the way, so-called competitive interests get in the way. They stop those collaborations, or the wish to desire or protect or not share data gets in the way, or regulation gets in the way, such as the European Union's Artificial Intelligence Act. So many barriers, but I still come down on the side of the need for greater and increased collaborations, and I'm inspired by the meetings such as the one we've had this morning and at COP16 here in Riyadh, and last week at the Science Forum South Africa, where you find constellations of people with very wonderful ideas. And I want to create environments which give expression to these ideas. And then from that, we can see practically what to do. But I think the first step is creating connections between people.
That's interesting. Yeah, you mentioned several stories of collaboration. Is there any one of your successful story were the most challenging, and it's you managed to bring it to the real life?
I think, there, as you say, there are many interesting ones, but I think I would point to the SKA, the Square Kilometre Array Telescope, which has a very, very interesting history. But I suppose the short version of it is that a wonderful South African scientist, Dr. Barney van Rooff, promoted the idea of the Square Kilometre Array Telescope, the SK, which is a global collaboration. But of course, you have to build it somewhere. And then there was a competition developed to host the SKA. South Africa bid to host the SKA, and we're very much part of the process to promote South Africa's bid to host the Square Kilometre Array. And thankfully, they won that, and the SKA is now being constructed in South Africa, and indeed other countries now. Since the bid process, Australia has become very much involved in other nations. And again, to stress, it's a global coalition, but the infrastructure will be in South Africa. And I think this is a wonderful example of really a nation setting out with a big idea and translating that into a concrete, in this case, literally lots of concrete is being used, but a concrete research infrastructure. And I think this is an example to the rest of the world of what collaboration can bring. And again, to stress, it is a global initiative. It was presented at the White House. It was on the cover of Time magazine, and it's still, I think, a showcase initiative and a shining example of what creative ambition can achieve.
This is really amazing. Another major part of your work is UN Science Summit. What is the main goal of this summit? How has it grown over the years? I know this is the 10th year, right?
This is the 10th year. The next one will be the 11th. So this year we have.
Was the 10th.
And it's had a very, in one sense, a very simple history, in the sense that the objective of the Science Summit 10 years ago and still today is a very simple one, and that is to promote awareness of the contribution of science to the United Nations SDGs. And simple though it may seem, of course, that's a big job, and I don't think we'll see the end of it or achieve that in a couple of lifetimes. But I think the pursuit is hugely important. And in my experience, although the United Nations is a tremendous organization with tremendous specialized agencies, I still felt there was a need to bring the science story to the attention of the General Assembly directly. And that's why we set up the Science Summit. We did the first version with in the European Parliament. Actually, it wasn't in it was in the European Parliament under the chairmanship of an Irish member of the European Parliament, Sean Kelly. And at that meeting, we designed the model, which was to bring folk together basically on an agenda that they produce. They propose ideas, and we just select them. And from that, then we grew the Science Summit into what it is today. Last year, 2023, we had just under 400 sessions. 50% of them were virtual, the rest were in person in New York. And this year, 2024, we had a similar amount. Next year, 2025, we will be having the Science Summit in New York, but we will also be participating at the United Nations WHO World Health Assembly in Geneva in May. And our approach there is very, very similar. It is advocating for science within the context of a narrative around the WHO. We feel that needs to be advanced, and there's a huge opportunity for bringing stakeholders together to both contribute and foster a much greater awareness of how science contributes to this process. And of course, within that, collaborative science at global level. Then in June of next year, we'll bring the science approach to the United Nations Financing for Development Summit, which will take place in Seville in Spain. And we're particularly fascinated by that because although it's a money summit, it's a financing for development summit. It's not a science summit, but that's why it's actually particularly attractive, because it allows us to bring science into this broad development financing agenda. And we feel that broad agenda really doesn't recognize science. It doesn't recognize the contribution of science. It doesn't fund science. Now, these are generalizations, of course, and there are some exceptions to that, but by and large, we want to do that, but we also want to foster a greater linkage between the development agenda and the science agenda globally as we would know it. And I think from that can then create much greater, much stronger, much more versatile, much more inclusive collaborations. We also feel that there's an opportunity to perhaps describe better how science contributes to development. And we're very much conscious of the focus on KPIs and on a competitive process to support science, which has many wonderful aspects to it. But of course, we're very conscious of the fact that it is also exclusive. It excludes many potential participants. And if that continues, then we feel that that's going to be bad for global science. So at the Financing for Development Conference, the FFD4 in Seville, next year, we're running a 3-day program which will bring together finance leaders to hear about how science works. Very strong focus on health, a very strong focus on AI, a very strong focus on communications technologies, and a number of other areas. So very much look forward to seeing you there, Dr. Nadine.
Hopefully, yeah. I would be delighted to be there. So science moving so fast. You just mentioned AI, climate change, health transformative. What do you think the policy makers should focus on to move forward? I think AI is a tough one.
It's a very tough one. AI is hugely tough, but I think before they move forward, they need to talk to each other. And we were at a number of COP meetings over the last couple of days, and many of them very inspirational. However, one thing that I will take away is the lack of policymakers in the room. So just in how science moves forward, I think it needs to move forward with a greater involvement with policymakers. They need to be in the room a lot more. It's moving fast, and I suppose it is a bit of a cliche to say, but we find that the European Union, with its AI regulation, is attempting to regulate the future, which I can understand the narrative. I can understand the policy objectives in terms of the European Union wanting to promote global standards, wants to promote guardrails. I think that's, I think it's a good argument. However, the process is exclusive. Many communities have been excluded from that, particularly our international and global partners. And I feel that's going to make for worse regulation. But in particular, I think we need to understand how science is going to be impacted by this. And this requires really a stronger engagement with and continuous engagement with policymakers. So my point there is that it's not a question of just, regulation or designing policies and, kicking them over the wall to be implemented by executives. I think there needs to be a constant engagement by policymakers in how science evolves and being able to respond to it. And I think if you look at the COVID experience, then the idea of spending a couple of years designing policy and then implementing it over another few years is, in light of COVID-19 is frankly ridiculous. And I think what COVID-19 has shown us is the need to have a resilient framework for policy making, regulation and science funding. But again, to repeat, for that to happen, there needs to be a much stronger continuous engagement with policymakers and regulators globally, not just from the north.
Well, correct me if I'm wrong. When scientists and policymakers work together, it's not as smooth as we think. What is the common mistake that you see, and what's your advice?
Well, I think, of course, everybody can be very well intentioned. So in that sense, I mean, it's difficult to fault anybody. However, practically, I think the challenges are for scientists to translate their work into policy options so that policymakers can understand. I think that's hugely significant, and I think that has to happen a lot more. I think also we talk about evidence-based policymaking, and I think a lot of the communities I interact with think that happens by default. It doesn't, and mainly because of the politicization of the policymaking process. That's very often rather evidence is not accepted, or it's not accepted into particular policy cycles. And I think this needs to be addressed. And I think the best way to address it is, again, having permanent fora for policymakers to engage with scientists. I think there are initiatives around science advice mechanisms, but I think it's not just a point of view, or not just a process really of presenting information. I think scientists need to get more involved in the actual design of policies, including the amendment of policies in legislatures.
So for our audience who would like to start or interested in science policy, what's your advice to them? How they can get started?
I would say the first step would be to find areas that are of interest to you. Of course, we're talking here about generally health sciences. But around that, we need to understand that there are many policy discussions, but I would make the distinction between general policy and supporting and related funding and regulations. And regulations is a hugely important area. Regulations that impact health sciences, they will include the European Union AI regulation and other regulations promoted in the United States and indeed elsewhere. So I think getting started would be to try and understand that. I think getting started also really requires one to engage with policymakers. So really, I would say to people who are interested in policymaking is to go talk to some legislators, find out what's in their head and try to respond to that. Otherwise, I think the assumption is that, you send emails to policymakers and ask them to sort of change legislation or adopt legislation. In my experience, it doesn't happen if you don't have the eyeball contact. That's why I call it, and I did before, a contact sport. And of course, it's about building coalitions. So in that sense, it's not an academic exercise. It's very much a real-time exercise in looking at dynamic policy making in the round and understanding, of course, the mechanics of that, how policy is made, how amendments are set down, how amendments are voted on, and then look for the adoption process of particular policies or regulations, and then also looking at their implementation and how policies are monitored, and how that monitoring can provide feedback for better iteration of policies in the future. So I think, get stuck in, I think, is my advice.
I was so inspired listening to your talk the whole day today. You had a long, impactful career. What keeps you motivated?
I think motivation comes from, frankly, the need to find ways to find solutions to many of the challenges that we are facing, and doing that with collaborators. And that makes me very optimistic indeed, because we are living in a really, really through difficult period. I don't know if that's going to be long or short, or if it's going to get more difficult. I have no idea. But in the meantime, we do need to find opportunities to congregate, to bring people together. And I think if anything, the nation state sometimes gets in the way of doing that. So we need to find ways to build communities that go beyond traditional national boundaries. And I'd be very optimistic about being able to do that in the future. But I think what unites us is greater than what divides us.
Looking ahead, what's the biggest challenge?
Very difficult to know. I suppose an obvious one is maybe another pandemic, or a version of a pandemic where the challenges are made more difficult by the security situation globally. We're seeing a lot of deprivation. We're seeing a lot of conflict. But in addition to a pandemic, I would see water wars as another area to be very concerned about. I don't have the figures in front of me, but according to the World Meteorological Organization, reading from recollection, that 4 out of 5 African nations won't have sustainable sources of water by 2030. And, you can be as optimistic as you like about the future, but if that's going to happen, that's a huge problem. But of course, then these problems are either exacerbated by political inaction or made complicated by conflict. So huge challenges there. I think also I don't think it's appreciated sufficiently, but I think the impact of AI collectively in our lives, I think we're only beginning to understand. But that, for me, that's not the issue. The issue for me is the tendency of the developed world, by which I mean the European Union and the United States, to regulate this space for everybody else. And I think that can be very damaging in terms of exclusion. I think it can be damaging in terms of excluding types of data from analysis. And I think it can be exclusionary in terms of dichotomy and promoting division. I think this is very, very challenging. And I think this could be a problem in the future.
Diklan, thank you very much for being here. This was very great conversation. Thank you for being with us. Thank you for spending the day with us. It was a pleasure to have you.
I have been honored and am delighted.
Thank you.
And congratulations on your leadership and work. And we really look forward to working together in the future.
Thank you, everyone, for listening to KSAU Master Talk. We will see you next episode. Until that time, take care and stay curious.